We're going to start a 3-week sequence about monetary valuation of environmental goods and services. And today I'm going to start with actually the whole purpose of why you want to do this. And I'm also going to talk extensively about what we actually mean by value, which is one of the more difficult and contentious parts of economics. I'm actually going to start with history. We're going to go back almost 3,000 years in time. This is where we are in the sequence. So I hope you all had a productive reading week, which reminds me, are there any questions about the essay? So it is about antibiotics, right? So there's a little bit of reading up to do. What are antibiotics? Why are they used? What can you do against them, right? But mostly the question is, what sort of policy instruments would you use to regulate antibiotics, right? That is essentially the question. I've given a similar essay a couple of times before. That is why there's also old essays on Canvas. What I don't like is people just playing back the slides that I've shown you, right? Which is not something I would expect in a third year of undergraduate studies. And the reason that that is not okay is because the question is not policy instruments in general. The question is, we have a problem. How would you actually do this? And in class I've argued in favor of taxation. How does it work? How would you apply a tax on antibiotics if that is what you propose? Not just all taxes are cost effective, but how does it actually work? So that is the sort of answer and the sort of essay that I would like to see, right? And if you come to the conclusion that taxes are, yes, wonderful in theory, but completely impractical, then of course you should draw that conclusion, right? Or maybe taxes work just fine on antibiotics, right? So that is the idea, not just play back the generics with the word antibiotic inserted here or there, but actually get into how would you do this. And of course, because of Brexit, we now have an opportunity to move away from the European style regulation, which is very much command and control. Or maybe the Europeans are right that this is the only way to do it, right? So that is in the past. We're now going to talk about valuation. You may have picked up that there has been a vote to have industrial action. Because that vote came only in last week, and the unions are now deciding what sort of shape industrial action would take, if any, because it may of course be that the pension fund and the university are going to give in to our demands, right, to avert industrial action. But the time schedule where we are now suggests that it won't affect the lectures of this term. It may be that it affects the start of next term, or, and that I think is more likely, and that will greatly affect you, that there will be a marking boycott. I haven't got a clue what the implications are. You will have to do your exam, but you won't get any grades for that, right? Is I think the implication. I haven't got a clue what this would imply. But it won't affect the sequence. But as I said, the next 3 weeks we're going to talk about valuation, and today I'm going to start with its aims and purposes. I've shown this one already. Value is, and the theory of value is at the core of economics. and every school of thought in economics has value somewhere very prominently. And this goes back to, as far as we know, to Aristotle. Presumably people before Aristotle have thought about this as well, but his thoughts have survived the times. We still know what Aristotle thought about this. And Aristotle distinguished between the value in use, how much something is worth to you, and the value in exchange, how much you pay for it on the market, and how much you would be willing to pay for it to buy, and how much you would be willing to get for it. I should share my screen in Zoom, is what you're saying, Nicholas. I think it's Nicholas.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
And now I need to go back here. And it did not mess up my thing this time. Very good. So how much you get for it on the market, or how much you would pay for it on the market versus what it's worth to you. Now Aristotle did not do this, but Adam Smith did, and that is the paradox of water and diamonds. So we can't live without water. You're dead within 48 hours if you don't take in any liquids, right? So that is absolutely essential to us. Yet in Aristotle's time water was free, in Adam Smith's time water was very cheap. And in our time it's still fairly cheap, right? 1,000 liters of water will set you back 50p, something like that, and 1,000 liters of water is like really, really big, right? Whereas diamonds, no matter what your girlfriend may tell you, are utterly useless. And definitely diamonds in the form of gemstones, right? In the form of jewelry. They're completely useless, yet extremely expensive. And for 3,000 years, almost, scholars have really, really wrestled with this. How can it be that something so precious is so cheap, whereas something so useless is so expensive? Now, the old guys, Aristotle, St. Augustine, and so on and so forth, were not interested really in this question of what is the value in exchange. They recognized that there's a market price for things, but they were simply not interested in this. This was not important to them. They didn't have proper theories or anything about this. They just acknowledged, yes, there is a value in exchange. Let's ignore this and focus instead on the value in use. And Aristotle argued that the value in use, what something is worth to you, is what it should be worth. And he was a humanist, and he argued based on philosophical principles that this reasoning about the intrinsic worth, about the intrinsic value, should guide us and should determine what something is worth in use. St. Augustine, it was about 400 years later, who brought old Greek philosophy into Western Europe, it's one of the church fathers, agreed and disagreed with Aristotle. Augustine said this should not be based, intrinsic value should not follow from humanist principles, not from philosophical principles, but should follow from theological principles. What something is worth is what God thinks it's worth, rather than what a bunch of philosophers argue something is worth. Of course, we don't know the mind of God, so it's still up to middle-aged and elderly white men. Well, white man is actually not right for Augustine. Middle-aged elderly men deciding what something is worth, right? It's still the same principle because we don't know the mind of God, so it is the interpreters of the will of God that determine what something is worth. Move again 800 years into the future. Thomas Aquinas, the great philosopher of the late Middle Ages, essentially completely agreed with Augustine and therefore with Aristotle that intrinsic value, value in use, is based on essentially God's will, or rather our interpretation of God's will, right? This is very alien to our minds, right? But this is what they argued. This doesn't work, but this does. This changed, or so you might think, in the early modern period, when not Tom Petty, but William Petty argued somewhat cryptically that labor is the father and active principle of wealth, as lands are the mother. So he moved away from this sort of God-given or philosophical principles type of valuation and said it's labor and land. Now, Petty was ahead of his time, and pretty quickly afterwards, Marquita Canne said, forget about labor, land is what drives value. And he actually went back to Aquinas and Augustine. So Canne argued that the laws of nature are God-given. God created the world, and the laws of physics. Agriculture is our closest point of contact with nature, and therefore the only way to sort of like figure out what God wanted is to study nature, and the only point where God touches the human economy is through agriculture, and therefore only agricultural activity is valuable and all other economic activities are parasitic on the value of agriculture, right? That is what the physiocrats argued. And it's still driven by theology, right? Now this, you may have guessed, is a French guy. I think we're in the 18th century by now. This is also self-serving for the elite, right? At this point in time, France was still a feudal economy and still an agricultural economy. That is, the powers that be were large landowners. And essentially they argued landowning is the only true value. Essentially, go away industrialists, go away merchants. We, the nobility, and Canne was a marquis, as I said, was part of that nobility, right? So this is self-serving in a way. The same can be said to a degree about Adam Smith, right? So now we're slightly later in time, but not a whole lot. We're still in the 18th century, but now we're at the end of the 18th century rather than the beginning, and we're in Scotland. And Adam Smith went back to Tom Petty and said, actually Petty said it's labor and land, and then the Canne said, no, it's just land, and Adam Smith said, no, it's just labor. If among a nation of hunters, for example, it usually costs twice the labor to kill a beaver which it does to kill a deer, then one beaver should naturally exchange for or be worth 2 deer, right? The labor theory of value. And this is Great Britain in the early stages of industrialization, where the nobility was losing power, where industrialists and merchants were taking over, and that was mostly driven by largely manual labor, right? So this is again somewhat self-serving, where Smith argues labor is so important in our economy, not with you friends. It is important in our own economy, and therefore it is universally important, right? Smith was actually not the first to have a labor theory of value. That was Ibn Khaldun. And Smith's theory was fairly incomplete. Has been refined by David Ricardo, and of course much more refined by Karl Marx, right? We see Marx as sort of the father of communism and Marxism. Marx was also one of the great classical economists. And they all worked on the labor theory of value, where essentially the intrinsic worth of something is determined by how much work you put in. Also, you can think back of Locke and the libertarians, right? Who also said, well, if I put in my labor, if I cultivated land, that land is mine, right? Very similar sentiment. Recently, there's been people like Teodescu Rögen, but also Costanza and O'Doom, who have argued that the real source of value is energy. That essentially everything comes back to the laws of thermodynamics, and if you want to know the true value of something, you should look at how much energy is embedded in this something. And to complete the circle, so this was early ecological economics. Late ecological economics, current ecological economics, goes back to the ecological footprint, or your carbon footprint. You cannot have escaped your attention that there are people who are fairly fond of using these words. The carbon footprint is essentially how much land do we need to plant with trees in order to absorb the CO2 that you've emitted, right? Everything is calculated back into areas. And the explicit reasoning of Ries and Wackernagel is that land is our ultimate resource and therefore the ultimate determinant of value, right? The planet overshoot days and those sort of things. We have only one Earth. That sort of reasoning all assumes that land is the ultimate source of value. And this is current thinking, right? This is not 3,000 years old. Bill Ries is getting very old, but still alive. Wackernagel, I think, is only 2 or 3 years older than I am. I think that's about right. Maybe 5 years. So, through most of history, there's been an absolute yardstick that determines what the value should be. And it has shifted over time what that value should be. It used to be ethical considerations, philosophical considerations, then it became religion, and land, labor, and energy, although land was actually also religion. And implicit in all this is that this is the intrinsic worth, this is the value in use, and this is what something should be worth. If the value in exchange, the market price, deviates from that, that is because the market is wrong. And Aristotle was very explicit about this, and Wackernagel is very explicit about this. The market gets it wrong, right? Capitalism is at the core of all environmental problems, if you believe these people. If prices deviate from values, that is because the market is immoral, right? The market is morally corrupt. And this is in very sharp contrast to the classical theory of value, where of course Adam Smith and a great many after him argued that market equilibrium is a Pareto optimum, and an optimum is an optimum, so the market is moral, right? The market is good. And this is, of course, at the heart of the contention of why economics is such a controversial subject, right? That the classical economists argue that the market is good, whereas philosophers and environmentalists from Aristotle to Wackernagel argue that the market is bad, right? But that is through history. We don't do this anymore as economists, right? We've had the neoclassical revolution that Jevons, Menger and Walras are the great marginal revolutionaries or neoclassical revolutionaries, where the emphasis or the analytical toolbox of economics started including marginal considerations. And essentially, what Jevons showed or argued is that the value in exchange equals the marginal value in use, completely taking away the diamonds versus water paradox, right? It's no longer a paradox. The reason that the price of water is so low, yes, it's priceless if we had no water, but we do have lots of water, right? And since we have lots of water, the price of water should be fairly low. Its total value is high, but its marginal value in use is very low, and therefore it is right that the exchange value is fairly low. Now, some of you may have seen the new Dune movie, right? It actually does not express this very well, but if you read the books, then this actually comes to the fore, right? On Arrakis, the marginal value of water is so very high that its price also is very high. And at that point, Herbert is actually a proper economist. At other points, he completely messes up the economics of his story, right? So that is one aspect of the marginal revolution, that essentially this contradiction between value in use and value in exchange disappears once you replace value in use with the value in use at the margin. The other aspect of neoclassical economics and current economics, neoclassical economics, of course, ended in 1936, right, with the general theory, is the concept of consumer sovereignty. We take utility functions as given. We say that the consumer is sovereign. If the consumer values something, then we are happy with that. We don't pass judgment on the utility function that somebody may have. We take that as given. And with that, economic analysis becomes not moral or amoral, not moral or immoral, but it becomes amoral. We simply take people's values as given. And therefore we do no longer pass judgment on whether a particular outcome is good or bad. We just say, well, this is the equilibrium. If people want to show off with polished gemstones, then they want to show off with polished gemstones, even if it is completely useless in my mind, and I absolutely do not see the value of diamonds whatsoever. But if other people do, then so be it, right? And if they want to pay a lot of money for a diamond ring, then they pay a lot of money for a diamond ring. That's not for me to say you are right or you are wrong, right? That is the accepted position in economics nowadays. So value is no longer an absolute concept, but it is a relative concept. It depends on demand versus supply, and it is context dependent. Something that is uncertain is worth less than something that is certain. something that is unique is worth more than something that is abundant, right? Now, you may wonder, why does he spend 30 minutes, well, 25 minutes on what is essentially ancient history? This is, it's important for environmental economics. This is also something that non-economists simply do not understand. Why economists value things the way they value things. And actually a lot of economists don't properly understand why this is, and do not properly appreciate the complete sea change that we saw through the marginal or the neoclassical revolution. That's why I dwell on this. And these are difficult things, and it's not immediately clear, right? And that follows also from the history, right? For 2,500 years, people were completely wrong about this, including people who were as brilliant as Aristotle, or as brilliant as Adam Smith, or as brilliant as Karl Marx, were just completely wrong, right? So, no surprise that a lot of people still don't understand this, right? Or why, as a young economist, you would struggle with this. Now, what sort of measures of value do we have? We'll come back to this next week, and particularly the week after. And this is actually the work of John Hicks, and these things are known as Hicksian equivalent variation or Hicksian compensating variation. That is, if you want to talk jargon, more intuitively, you can also call this the willingness to pay or the willingness to accept compensation. So the willingness to pay is your supermarket scenario. How much I value something I do not have is how much I am willing to pay to get it, or the maximum amount I am willing to pay to get it, right? And this is what you do in the supermarket. You go in with money and you come out with less money but more peanut butter, right? That is willingness to pay. Or let's make it a pint of milk. Willingness to accept compensation is an opposite scenario. You walk out of the supermarket with your pint of milk, and somebody walks into you and knocks the pint of milk out of your hand, and it spills on the pavement, and it's no longer of any use to you. How much would you accept in compensation so as to be made whole again? And here, because it's the other way around, it's the minimum amount of compensation you would require to be equally well off, right? So you had a pint of milk, you lose it, but now you get more money, right? And the question is, what sum would make you equally well off? That is the Hicksian compensating variation, or your willingness to accept compensation, right? That's how we measure value theoretically. Now, what types of value do we have? There's two broad classifications. Say we're looking at a stream in a forest. I don't know where this is. This is George's picture. And the notes doesn't say where it is. One popular classification is to look at the services that this particular stream provides. And those services come in four broad categories. The first is provisioning services. Food, fresh water, fuel wood, fiber, biochemicals, right? Those are the things that we directly use and that we take from nature, and that is valuable to us. And the idea here is that you have a forest, and that forest produces nuts or produces rubber, right? And we value the forest because of the nuts that it gives us, right? There's also regulating services, and the forest does more than produce nuts. It also soaks up CO2 and is therefore important for climate. It soaks up air pollutions, so it's good for air quality. It also regulates water, right? If you have a bare hillside, the water just runs off and floods the valley. But if you have a hillside with lots of vegetation on, it acts as a sponge. If it rains, it soaks up the water and releases it slowly, so the valley does not flood, right? That would be a regulating service. There's cultural services. You may just go and enjoy yourself in the forest, right? Without using it, in the sense that you take away from the forest. You may go and be inspired by it. You may just like the sight of it, right? All those are services provided by the forest to us humans. And then finally, there's a category of supporting services, things that do not matter to us, but matter to us indirectly. So another thing that soil does, that forests do, is build up humus and compost in the soil, builds up organic matter. It doesn't matter to us, but indirectly it makes future trees grow better, right? So it matters to us indirectly. They play a role in the cycling of nutrients. So this is one way of looking at values, all the different values that nature provides to us. And then in a valuation exercise, what you would do is go through them one by one, tick them off, and put a euro value or a pound value on it. We're in the UK, right? Earlier this morning I was teaching in Amsterdam, and then you need to talk in euros. Sorry about that. This is one way of doing it. It's fairly popular with ecologists and ecological economists. Environmental economists, I think, prefer to look at this concept of total economic value, which consists of three broad categories: use value, option values, and non-use values. Which then fall into direct and indirect use, which is consumptive or non-consumptive, option and quasi-option values, and others use and pure existence values. And then other use falls again into bequest and altruism. Now that all sounds very abstract, right? So let's look at a forest again. George's notes do not tell me where that forest is. So let's look at, it's a rainforest, is the only thing I know. So what would be consumptive or extractive direct use values? Timber, fuel wood, nuts, right? You go into the forest, you get out something that you want, right? And you use it. So that's a direct use value, and it is no longer there. Non-consumptive use would be the aesthetic value, the amenity value, the recreational value of the forest. You still go in and directly use it, right? But the forest doesn't change because of your activity. Whereas, of course, if you chop down a tree for fuel wood, it does change, right? So those are non-consumptive direct use. An example of indirect use would be watershed regulation, would be soil conservation, right? These are not things that are immediately important to us, but if these were not there, then in the future, the direct and the direct uses would fall in value, right? If there's no soils anymore, then the trees won't grow and you can't get your fuel wood out, right? Those are use values, and three types of use values. And I think this is fairly intuitive to most people. The next two, or the next five, are perhaps less intuitive. Option values are not about use, but are about potential future use. right? So you may have a pristine forest, and you may think, well, I want to start a tourist resort here so that people can look at the monkeys and at the birds in my forest, right? But it's not there at the moment, so this is an option value. But you can very easily imagine that this happens because there's tourism and ecotourism in many places already, so why not in your pets or forest? The quasi-option value is something that people often struggle with. A quasi-option value depends on something that might be there but isn't quite. And the standard example is that in this patch of rainforest there is a unique tree that doesn't grow anywhere else, a unique species of tree that doesn't grow anywhere else, and in the sap of the tree is a cure for cancer. Of course, if we then lose this patch of rainforest, we would lose this particular species of tree and therefore the use and therefore the cure for cancer. We don't know that it's there, and even if it's there, we don't know how to extract it and how to turn it into medicine, right? So it depends, the value depends on contingencies that have yet to be realized, right? That's a quasi-option value. An option value is you're sure you can make it work. Quasi is, yeah, perhaps, right? We haven't found it yet, but it might be there, right? Non-use values are tricky. We value things because our children or grandchildren may want to enjoy this, right? That's a bequest value, so that's used by others. We may want to preserve the rainforest because maybe our children will one day want to walk into this forest. Or we may feel for other people and value their pleasure they take from this forest, right? So that's altruism. Bequest is altruism towards your descendants. Altruism is altruism towards people who are not related to you, who are not descent from you. And I think we talked about this before. This is very tricky in economic accounting, right? Because as soon as in our accounting we start to include altruism, then if somebody popular is unhappy, that counts more, because we all feel sorry for that person, than when somebody unpopular is unhappy. Then we may not care, or we may even enjoy the misery of somebody else. And that is, of course, not how a government should act, right? That is not how you act in the public interest by giving greater weight to the happiness or misery of popular people, or people with lots of siblings, right? Or lots of friends. That's not how you would want to do public policy. So altruism is important in why we care about things, and it's important in describing our behavior as a motivation for the way we act, but you need to be very careful when you use these values in public policy advice. The final one is the pure existence value. First posited by Crutella in the 60s, and that is we value things just because they are, not because we want to use it, not because we think our children will use it, not because we think it might one day help cure cancer. No, there are certain things we value just because they are. And that can be, you may just enjoy the notion that there's whales swimming out in the ocean, even if you're not going whale watching, even if you're not watching documentaries on television because they're so boring, you may just value that. You can also see this as an expression of our ethical duty or our stewardship towards nature, or you can see it as a reflection of the rights of other species. But we, and this comes out in a lot of empirical studies, we value things just because. And that would be an existence value. So, let's turn, so we've done what is value, we've done types of value. Now let's look at why you would want to put a pound sign on these things. And some of this we've seen before. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why you would want to value things. You may want to do a cost-benefit analysis, that is compare the impacts of environmental damage to the impacts of emission reduction. I'll come back to that. You might want to impose the good tax, we've seen that. The good tax is measured in money, so you need to somehow have these things in money, and you may recall that I just assumed that this was possible. Similarly, in the cost-benefit analysis, we just assumed that this was possible. You may want to pay for environmental services, you may want to extend the national accounts to include the impacts on the environment, or you may want to compensate somebody for the damage that is done. And in all these cases, money is the appropriate indicator. So money, recall, has three functions. It's a store of value, it's the unit of exchange, but it's also the unit of accounting. And that is how you should see money in this case, as a unit of accounting. We do not value the rainforest because we want to sell it, but because we want to know how much it's worth compared to other things that we care about. Not getting emotional, I'm just losing my voice. I've shown you this particular citation by Robert Solow already. Yes, we do need to quantify things, and we do need to monetize things in order to properly advise policy. And I'll make this all a bit more precise. And these are the sort of things that we want to value: coral reefs, the climate, mountain landscape, or biodiversity. These are frogs and baby frogs, or dwarf frogs of a different species, but I think it's baby frogs. So we talked about cost-benefit analysis. We assess the total costs and benefits of something, and then we find out whether the costs are greater than the benefits, right? And the important distinction between cost-benefit analysis and social cost-benefit analysis is that we include everything that matters to society, not just to a company. And the whole purpose is to weigh the two. And in a cost-benefit analysis, all impacts must be estimated and expressed in money. Now, the must be estimated, I think, is obvious, right? Because otherwise they're simply excluded. The expressed in money is less obvious. I don't think I've shown this here. If we have one thing we care about, and we think that more is better, then it's pretty clear that A is bigger than B, right? There's no debate about this. If you think that less is better, if it's environmental pollution rather than income, then you just flip the sign, and B is better than A, right? So this is simple and straightforward. Now, if we care about two things, then it's pretty clear, and we still think that more is better, it's pretty clear that A is better than B, right? Because it's better in the horizontal dimension and it's better in the vertical dimension. So in both cases, A is better than B. And it does not matter whether we care more about vertical things than about horizontal things. if we introduce situation C, we can actually also come up with a proper preference ordering, because C is the same in one dimension but worse than A in another dimension. So A dominates C, and at the same time C dominates B, because you're indifferent in one dimension, in the horizontal dimension, and you're better off in the vertical dimension, right? So C is better than B but worse than A. Similarly, if we introduce D, and that sign is in the, oh no, that sign is between A and B. Now I'm going too fast. D is worse than A in one dimension and the same in the other, but it's better than B in one dimension and the same in the other. So D is better than B, but worse than A, right? So far we have not found any problem whatsoever by not having expressed things in money. But if we compare C and D, you no longer know. You cannot say that C is better than D, because C is worse in one dimension and it's better in the other dimension. So you do not know. You cannot say C is better than D or D is better than C. Simply mathematically impossible to do this, right? So what cost-benefit analysis does is essentially, rather than looking at horizontal and vertical, rather than looking at X and Y, you make a linear combination of the two, and you say that the relative price of Y is A times the unit price of X, and you add them up, and then you are in one dimension again. Then you go from the bottom situation where it's ambiguous to the top situation where you can say more is better. And you can only say more is better if you are in a single dimension, right? So this is money as the unit of account. Now, some people don't like cost-benefit analysis and instead propose multi-criteria analysis. Multi-criteria analysis is just cost-benefit analysis, but instead of having a linear combination, you have some function of X and Y to find your W, right? It's nothing special. I mean, there's a lot of abracadabra in multi-criteria analysis, but it all boils down to this. And you could say, well, any function can be approximated to a degree with a linear function, right? So I don't really see the point of multi-criteria analysis. So that is one purpose of environmental valuation, right? Yeah, you can do it. The second purpose is to use it in regulation, to actually find the tax, right? An example here is quarrying. Quarrying has lots of externalities. There's noise, there's dust, there's vibration, there's water contamination, and of course it looks completely differently after quarrying than before quarrying. And you probably have traveled a little bit around the Sussex countryside. There's these quarries for limestone everywhere, right? And they look dramatic to us because they're very steep cliffs. But don't think that those cliffs are natural, right? They are just dug up and completely changed the way the hillside used to look, and of course then attracts different vegetation and so on and so forth. If you want to find the efficient level of quarrying, then externalities must be internalized, right? And what used to be the Department for the Environment, Transport in the regions, I'm going to say, but it's now DEFRA, right? Environment, Foods, and regional something. actually don't know. This is actually what they did, right? So they commissioned studies and said, what is the value of the externalities? And what these studies found was that the willingness to accept compensation for sand and gravel extraction was, according to one study was, the willingness to accept compensation was £9 per ton of sand and gravel extracted. The willingness to pay was £2 per ton extracted. And what they did was indeed impose this levy, right? So this is these valuation studies directly informing the government and directly setting what you could argue is the Pigou tax. You could of course also argue that these studies are incorrect and the value is much higher or much lower, and they're definitely the studies are now quite old, but that doesn't matter. The tax is still those £2 per ton. So if you want to dig up sand, if you want to dig up gravel, this is how much you pay to the government in order to minimize or optimize the environmental impact, right? So that is one reason why you want to do this. And this is actually fairly common in the UK. There's a landfill tax. There's a lot of greenhouse gases that come out of landfill. Methane being one, and the price for methane is actually set on my work. Completely outdated and old study, but if you want to throw tomatoes at the originator of the landfill tax because you do not like paying more for your waste, here is your target. Landfills also release toxic fumes. There's a lot of smell coming out of it. They can be very noisy, and they're definitely very ugly to look at. And all those things have been valued and are taxed in nowadays England and Wales, since Scotland went its own way. Another example is the air passenger duty, which used to reflect the CO2 that came out, but of course in the budget of now 2 weeks ago, and we've forgotten all about the budget of 2 weeks ago because of all the sleaze that is going on in the government, right? That link was actually slashed by our dear friend Rishi Sunak, right? Where the air passenger duty is now essentially a random number, but it used to be tied to the value, the marginal value of the greenhouse gases emitted. I'm going way too fast, guys. Other applications are if you want to pay compensation, because you can only pay compensation in money essentially. Compensation in kind doesn't really help. This is the Deepwater Horizon. 2009, I want to say, but don't cite me on that. Where this big oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico, owned but not operated by British Petroleum, went up in flames. A bunch of people on the platform were killed, and there was a major oil spill, and a lot of birds died as a result. Actually, my notes say it was in 2010. So an enormous oil spill, lots of damage to the environment. And then the question is, how much money should British Petroleum have spent on preventing this, right? So there's a small probability that it happens. What would the damage be, right? And then that probability times the expected impact is how much they should have spent to prevent this. And how much, that's what George wants to do. I'm reading the notes at the same time. So how much would you have paid to prevent this? Would you have paid £1? no hands. Would you have paid £5? Would you have paid £50? Right? What is this worth to you? Of course, that also begs the question, suppose that there is this willingness to pay to prevent these sort of things, what are you actually going to do about this, right? So how much should we spend on prevention? How should we legislate for all this? It's one option, or perhaps you could go through the route of litigation, where actually this sort of stuff, like spilling lots of oil into the environment, is not something that is actually allowed. It happened anyway, so you can litigate against this and ask for compensation for the damage that is done. So in litigation, it is important to set fines and damages, and they are often, definitely in the US, inspired or directly taken from the valuation literature that we're going to talk about next week and the week after. In the damages that are set, there's actually text there. Valuation may inform fines and damages. You can't read that. And the most famous case here was another oil spill. This was way before you guys were born, in 1989, where the Exxon Valdez, or Valdez, I think you should say, obviously owned by what was then Exxon, right? This was before Exxon was ExxonMobil. It was a single hulled tanker, and it ran aground in Alaska in the Prince William Sound, and it spilled basically all its oil and killed an enormous amount of birds and fish and did enormous damage. There's two consequences of this. One is regulation and litigation, and regulation and legislation that essentially bans single-hulled tankers. And nowadays tankers are much safer, and you can have this sort of accident without spilling all your oil. Well, that's good. But there was also an enormous amount of litigation, because essentially the people in Alaska, and a lot of people who were not in Alaska but cared or pretended to care about what's going on in Alaska, sued Exxon and wanted compensation. Now this is, as well as the state of Alaska. Now this was important because this was the first time that actually the courts really became involved in this, and really a lot of compensation was demanded. And Richard Carson, an old friend, estimated the value of all this damage to be somewhere between 3 and 9 billion. And right, this is now 30 years ago. 30 years? Yeah, 30 years ago. So that's a fair amount of money, definitely worth much more than the contents of the oil tanker and the oil tanker itself. This was the first time that this actually ended up in court. Nowadays this is more routine. The other reason that this particular case was important was because Exxon, being Exxon, did not take this lying down and actually funded a lot of research to show that Richard Carson was all wrong, which then stimulated a whole bunch of other research showing that Carson was not wrong. So it was actually a big stimulus for the valuation literature that we're going to talk about, particularly the week after next. A lot of this was done through contingent valuation studies. And a lot of the methodological progress that we've seen in contingent valuation is a direct result of these lawsuits, and particularly lawyers funding research to show that the opposite party should pay more damage, or that the damage wasn't as big as people claimed. You can also use these valuation studies to demonstrate the value of the environment. Whereas if you don't do this, right, if you have a piece of forest and somebody wants to burn it down or chop it up and put cattle on, the value of the cattle, the pasture land, is clear, right? That's the steaks that you can sell. So that case is easily made. There's a useless piece of forest, let's cut it down, or let's burn it down and put cattle on, and then we can export steak to the United States. That case is, the business case there is very easily made. So if you want to counter that argument, you should be able to say, but the forest is also worth something. And it then really helps if you don't come with fluffy language, but if you actually can put a dollar sign or a real sign or a peso sign on it and say, it's actually worth more if we leave the forest be. And you really need to then make those numbers hard, because the business case for cutting down the forest is also done in monetary terms, right? So that is one reason or another reason why you would want to value things. And you can take this a step further, and this is known as payment for environmental services, where you actually not just demonstrate that something is worthy, but you're actually going to pay for it, right? And this is known as payment for environmental services, as I said, and it's not, it's more and more common. That essentially what you do is you pay people to preserve nature or conserve nature. You can see this as internalizing an externality. Sometimes it is. You can see it as a way of bribing people. You could also see it as a cogent bargain, right? And we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. In every case, there is money changing hands from the potential polluter or the potential destroyer of the environment. No, there's money flowing to the potential polluter or the potential destroyer of the environment, right? And as I said, this is not uncommon. This particular story in The Guardian is now 10 years old, where essentially money was raised from governments, from firms, from no, that doesn't say firm, it says film star. From governments and from people like Leonardo DiCaprio, right? And said Ecuador wanted to extract oil. Oil is valuable, you can sell it. But the potential oil fields were bang in the middle of the rainforest. They wanted to cut down the forest. And essentially a group of philanthropists and some public money, they got together and said, we're going to give you 75 million if you don't do this. And that was convincing enough an argument for Ecuador to say, okay, we're not going to do it, right? Now I don't know how this story ended. I only know that in 2011 they said, we're not going to do it now. Of course, they may have had in the back of the minds, we're not going to do it now. We're going to put, we're going to take the 75 million, and then in 10 years' time, the oil is still there, right? So we can do it then. I don't know whether and how this story ended. And then, of course, if you want to pay the 75 million, you somehow also need to make hard to the Leonardo DiCaprios of the world that this is a worthwhile investment for them, right? Which is much easier because he's a bit of a woolly and fluffy person, so it's easy to convince him of something that perhaps you shouldn't be convinced about. Of course, if you want to take government money, you should come with more solid evidence. The issue here about payment for environmental services is, of course, again, you would want to find the optimum, so you would want to find the willingness to pay. The issue here is, of course, that this can also be done the other way around, right? And we've definitely seen the Chinese government acting this way, essentially saying, nice piece of dolphin you have here, and extracting bribes from Western philanthropists to protect this particular animal, right? So there's a bit of unsavoriness going on as well. And the final application of environmental valuation is to include things in the national accounts. And we're going to talk about that in week 11. The national accounts, GDP, includes only market transactions. So anytime you damage the environment, all the environmental externalities are not in GDP. And therefore, if you think these things are valuable, GDP is the wrong measure of what is really going on in the economy, definitely the wrong measure of welfare. And if you start including, if you want to include, because it's all market transactions, so GDP is, I don't know, what's the GDP of the UK? 500 billion, or maybe more. It's way more than 500 billion. Right, there's 60 million people or so in this country. You need to multiply it with the average income, so you end up with way more than 500 billion. If you say, well, this number is too low, because, or too high, because we exclude all the negative impacts on the environment. If you want to make that argument hard, you again need to put a monetary value on all these things, right? So today I talked about what is value and what sorts of value there are, and I talked about all the uses of these monetary values. So next week we're going to talk about how to do this, and the week after we are again talking about how to do this, because it's much easier to say you should do this and it has all these different applications than to actually do this, to actually measure somebody's appreciation or lack of appreciation of an environmental good or service. So that is for next week and the week after, and we're going to talk about methods.